Hello everyone, my name's Geraldine Baird and I am very grateful and honoured to be asked to take part in this project. This year's a bit different because of the virus. We can't meet up and mourn our dead. But let's hope this video will go some way to fill the void. I am a Rutherglen. I was born and bred in Rutherglen. Love the Royal Borough, and I think it's wonderful that we are having a chance to remember our dead, our young men who went to war and didn't come back to Rutherglen. But we've also got to remember all the soldiers, all the airmen, all the sailors, and the millions of women who worked in munitions and did men's work during the war. Not forgetting the 16 million animals who perished. So this film is not about glorifying or justifying war, but it is remembering that they fought so that we could live the lives we live today. And we should remember them with gratitude and pride and thanks. When we wear the red poppy, it is a universal symbol of remembrance and hope, including hope of a positive and peaceful future. So I hope you find this little film informative and interesting. I must thank Jason and David for letting me be part of the project, and thank you for watching. World War broke out in July 1914 and officially ended on November the 11th, 1918. It is hard for us to imagine the scale of the conflict. Humanity had never seen the horrors of war on such a massive scale. Over 40 countries took part, with some 70 million soldiers in action on different fronts throughout the world. Across the globe, 16 million people were left dead. This war has been described as the Great War, the War of Nations, the war to end all wars. 100 years on, we are all connected to the First World War, either through our own family history, or the heritage of our local community, or the long-term impact on society and the world we live in today. At the start of the war, a surge of men signed up as combatants. In Britain, 900,000 volunteered in the first 3 months. 20,000 signed up in Glasgow in August alone. There may have been some Rutherglen men amongst these. I think these men were motivated by a strong sense of duty. Many of our Lanarkshire men joined the local regiment, the Cameronians Scottish Rifles. They had 27 battalions during the First World War. So by the end of 1915, 320,000 Scots had volunteered. That was 13% of the total British Army. There were more Scots volunteered in proportion to the size of the population than any other area in the UK. Rutherglen men signed up and Rugelonians supported the war effort in other crucial ways. We had the steelworks, the mines and some agriculture. Colville's at that time was the largest individual steelworks in the country, and they raised their output tremendously. Steel was needed for steel billets to make high explosive shells and also for ships. So Lanarkshire's population kept the war effort supplied with vital goods. As more men joined up, it was decided it was a good idea to keep groups coming from the same place together. So the Pals battalions were formed. Whole streets of young men were going off to war together. But the downside was that many died together, and those families who knew each other well were dealt a very, very heavy blow. One example was the Hearts football team. 16 Tyneside players volunteered to fight. Many joined the Macrae's battalion. 7 of those stars were killed, and others never played again because of the wounds or the effects of gas. Local businesses set an example. In 1914, Templeton's factory was one of the largest employers in Glasgow. Templeton's contributed to the war effort by producing materials for the War Office, primarily blankets, with 4 million blankets being produced by the end of the war, more than any other firm. Templeton's employees joined the Pals battalion as 400 signed up. 40 gave their lives. While the men were sacrificing life and limb on the war front, home support was of vital importance. The whole area of Lanarkshire was thoroughly behind the war effort. Local relief funds were quick to be set up and fundraisers were organised. Everyone was doing their bit, even the local scouts as they patrolled, and the girls from the laundry knitting socks. In fact, the soldiers were short of spectacles and people gave theirs. But the people left behind, the grieving mothers, fathers, children, brothers and sisters, they could only imagine the horror their loved ones endured fighting on the front line. They couldn't understand the level of fear, trauma and bloodshed experienced so many young men all huddled together in filthy trenches, exchanging gunfire with German enemies. An important way to raise morale was sending letters. In 1916, Daniel Roger, the founder of the Rutherglen Evangelical Institute, sent a letter to over 700 of our local troops serving on foreign soil. Many of the soldiers had went to his church in Greenbank Street before the war broke out. And by 1916 he had recorded 682 Institute members serving in the war, but by the end of the war 1,034 men were on that roll of honour. 164 of those men did not come home. In 1914, Rutherglians opened hearts and homes to a group of Belgian refugees. Belgium was a neutral country and was invaded by the Germans at the start of the war. The Belgians were officially called guests of the Rutherglen Corporation. The generosity of our people meant that they were met with an outpouring of humanity. I think it's hard to understand the scale of this war when we look at the numbers. It's easy to forget that each number was a young man who had his life in front of him, and he was cut down in his prime or maimed for life. Across Scotland, 148,000 men lost their lives, 18,000 from Glasgow. Almost every Scot at that time would have been directly or indirectly affected by the death of a member of the armed forces. Rutherglen gave many lives. 545 fallen men's names are etched on our cenotaph, and almost 1,000 young soldiers from Rutherglen and Cambuslang who fought for their country in World War I never came back to tell the tale. Also, the casualty numbers were crushing. 1 in 4 of the 550,000 Scottish men who joined up, they were killed or injured. Scottish casualty rates was 27% compared to 11% for the rest of the British Army. According to the historian T.C. Smout said, "It is not known how many Scots died in the war. One well-argued estimate put the figure at 110,000. That is equivalent to 10% of the Scottish male population between 16 and 50, and probably 15% of the total British war dead. That sacrifice was higher in proportion terms than any other country in the Empire." Many young men lost their lives. William Shearer and Margaret Everin, who stayed above the library in Library House, Ross Shearer was our first librarian, lost a son, Gordon Shearer. He was only 20. In December 1917, Gordon's father received the news his son had died. His seaplane had crashed. He fell into the water. No trace of him was found. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Medal and the British War Medal. There were many acts of bravery, some accounted for and some not. The Scottish soldiers were seen as brave, loyal and trustworthy, men who could be relied on to fight to the end for their friends, their regiment and their country. And for such a relatively small geographical area, it's astonishing to note that 9 Lanarkshire men were awarded the Victoria Cross, one of the highest area totals in the whole country. How do we remember those that had fallen in the war? There are over 1,000 civic memorials dedicated to World War I, located throughout cities, towns and villages of Scotland. The Imperial War Graves Commission created and cared for over 600 cemeteries in France and Belgium. The act of observing silence at 11 AM on 11th of November started in 1919. The wearing of the poppy started at the same time, and the British Legion came into being in 1921. Every year on the 11th of November, we remember the unknown warrior. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. The Provost of Rutherglen called a meeting on May the 10th, 1920 to consider the erection of a memorial. There was some talk about a social club, there was some talk about a hospital, and two locations were considered: the old entrance to Overton Park, or where our memorial now stands at the west of our main street. The Rutherglen Memorial was unveiled on the 26th of October 1924. The memorial itself was by Robert Gray Sculptures of Glasgow, and the bronze figure of courage is by George Pullen. On the 26th of October 1924, there was a parade of youth organisations and war veterans through the streets of Rutherglen. Colonel Gray Buchanan, who lost two sons in the war, unveiled the memorial. After the flags had fallen from the memorial, there was a 1-minute silence, and at its close a prayer of dedication was offered. The last post, then the pipers played the Flowers of the Forest, and the bugle sounded as the wreath was laid. The Reformer reported that the bells were rung in the town hall, but against an atmosphere of mixed celebration and pain, the hoisting of the Union Jack was a signal. It seemed as if a fairy wand had passed over the borough, but mingled with joy there was a sad recollection of loved ones who had gone away. Rutherglen also erected another memorial in Mill Street, constructed in the 1920s. Unlike the Main Street Memorial, this one had no names, and it was for the killed or missing in Belgium and France. The First World War had taken a devastating toll of Scots who put on a uniform and served in the forces, and it subjected families at home to enormous anxiety, suffering and grief. After all the loss and carnage, people wanted a better world. The 1918 armistice brought great celebration, but also challenges for the country to move forward in peacetime. December 1918 saw an election, and for the first time, some women and all men above the age of 21 were allowed to vote. Wilson wrote, "Women held the line just as our menfolk held the line at the Ypres in the Somme. But the economy was in a poor state. Unemployment in 1921 reached 11.3%, the highest point since records began. Organisations like the British Legion became a lifeline for many unable to find work. This was a far cry for homes fit for heroes, and it was felt these sacrifices were not recognised. In 1914, some people were living in terrible conditions, and diseases like tuberculosis, consumption were rife in the overcrowded tenements. There were chronic complaints. Poor nutrition was widespread. After the war, 500,000 homes had been planned, but this was well meant and didn't happen. Less than half were completed. Many people in Scotland faced living in squalor until the end of the 20s, yet expectations had been raised of a brighter future. There were some reforms which greatly improved social conditions. For the first time, taxes were made fairer. Many types of job saw the introduction of a minimum wage. The National Insurance Act gave for the first time sick pay, and unemployment benefits were introduced. Children were given free school meals for the first time in order to improve the nation's very poor nutrition. But the lasting effects of the war lingered. we had lost virtually a generation of young men, and those who did come home, many inhabited a world of pain and suffering beyond comprehension, a world of amputations, mutilations, blindness, paraplegic, wrecked lungs and emasculation, crippled by gas, suffering horrendous psychological damage. Perhaps in truth there could be no happy ever after for those returning from the Great War. For them, no land fit for heroes for the 8 million souls whose life were utterly changed and the 16 million lost worldwide. We did not learn the truth about war. There are no winners, only losers.